The third important section is John chapter 1 verses 14 to 18. The Word becomes the incarnate Son. The scripture says here, and the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we have seen His glory, the glory as of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to Him and cried out that it was He about whom I said, He who comes after me ranks ahead of me because He was before me. From His fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made Him known. Verse 14 represents a climatic moment in the prologue, in that it depicts the Word becoming. To this point, the Word has been described in terms of His eternal existence. The narrator has accomplished this by using the Greek word eimi, that is to be. The eternal existence of the Word is clearly seen in chapter 1 verses 1 to 2. That in the beginning was, that means N, the Word, and the Word was, that is N, with God, and the Word was God. And He was with God in the beginning. In verse 14, the narrator sets up an intentional contrast between what the Word has always been, that is eimi, to what the Word has now become, that is ginoma, the Greek word. Never before has the Word become anything. The Word has always been simply being, but now the Word has become flesh and has made a home among the humanity. The intentional contrast created by the use of verbs to be and to become underscores the significance of this particular incarnation. The Word has been transformed into a new mode of existence on behalf of His people. In this way, the story of Jesus told by the Gospel of John is quite different from what we see in the other New Testament Gospels. For John, Jesus has quite literally stepped out of the heavens in order to take on human flesh. Verse 14 contains two other Greek words that call for clarification. Firstly, the affirmation that the Word became flesh and lived. The word over there used is eskenosen. Among humanity expands the basic image of taking human flesh. The noun skene, or tent or shelter, and the related verb skeno, to take up residence, are used in Septuagint in reference to the tabernacles constructed by the Israelites during their wilderness experiences. We can see in Leviticus chapter 23, 42 to 43. By the time of Jesus, one of the major festival celebrations for the Jewish people was Sukkot, known in Hebrew Bible as the festival of ingatherings or the festival of seventh month. We can see this in Exodus chapter 23 verse 16, 34 verse 22 and Nehemiah chapter 8 verse 14. Though it is often known today as the Feast of Tabernacles, the festival commemorated Jehovah's presence with His people while they lived in temporary shelters during their arduous journey through the whole wilderness. There can be a little doubt that this verb is meant to recall the events of the whole Exodus. We have already indicated that John's Gospel situates the story of Jesus in a wider story of Israel's God as told in Genesis and Exodus. Earlier only we said about this. This verse represents one more major connection to its early stages in Yahweh's dealing with Israel. There can also be a little doubt that John's Gospel intentionally connects Jesus with the major religious feasts of Israel. The subtle cue in verse 14 is initial evidence of what will become a more prominent theme throughout the whole Gospel. Jesus as the fulfillment or the replacement of the outward trappings of Jewish religious life. The second Greek word that begs for clarification is the term monogenos, a word that has for centuries been rendered as only begotten. In the Western world, the odd phrase has entered a popular consciousness through the whole public recitations of John chapter 3 verse 16. Perhaps the most well-known verse in the New Testament, those within and outside the Christian tradition. However, this familiar translation is probably rooted in an incorrect understanding of the word's etymology. Previously, it was thought that monogenos was a compound word comprised of monos only and geneo to beget or to give birth. Hence, it has been a commonplace to speak of Jesus as God's only begotten Son. However, most recent research suggests that the term is a combination of monos, that is only, and genos, that is a type or a kind. This would seem to indicate that for John, Jesus is one of a kind, or more appropriately, a unique one from the Father, rather than the only begotten of the Father. While it may have been true that the Gospel of John, Jesus is the only begotten Son of God, the term monogenos does not point to that truth. Instead, monogenos points to a uniqueness of Jesus Christ. He is the only one who has ever existed eternally with God, and also the only one to step out of heaven to take on human flesh. In these ways and others that will emerge throughout the whole narrative story, Jesus is the unique one from the Father. Further, the unique one is full of grace and truth. The phrase that is almost universally regarded as an echo of God's covenant faithfulness toward Israel in Exodus chapter 34 verse 6. The next verse provides the reader with a literary technique known as a prolepsis. A prolepsis statement anticipates something that will take place in narrative and often does so by speaking of that event in the past tense. Verse 15 recounts John's testimony that Jesus is greater than him because of his heavenly origins. This testimony has not yet taken place but will appear almost verbatim in verse 30 on the second day of recorded activity in the narrative. Prolepsis are basically reader elevating devices that put the reader in a position of privilege and lay a groundwork for something that will happen or at a later stage in the whole narrative. This is one of the several instances in which the narrator speaks of an event prior to its occurrence. Once again, John the Baptist appears to be a reliable witness commissioned by God to testify on behalf of Jesus. The incarnation of the Word is a cosmic event that brings about an all-surpassing gift to humanity. In verse 16, this gift is described as a provision of grace upon grace. The word grace in Greek, that is charis, figures prominently in this unit of prologue, appearing 4 times in between verses 14 to 17. In keeping with our reading strategy of letting John be John, apart from the other first century interpreters of Jesus, it is necessary to point out that the word charis, grace, does not mean the same thing here as it does in the writings of Paul. The word more properly refers to a gift or a favorable disposition, and it seems clear that God's gift to humanity is Jesus, the Word made flesh, who brings light and life to the world. His coming has yielded a gift after gift, or an attitude of extreme favor towards humanity. Verse 17 offers yet another link to Exodus imagery. Moses, the leader who spoke with Yahweh face to face, was the great lawgiver who unveiled Torah to Israel. We can see in Exodus 19 and 20 and 34. In the same way, Jesus is the one who has eternally existed face to face with God. He alone has unveiled grace and truth, which extends God's program begun in Moses. In a final affirmation of the intimate union between the Father and the Son, the narrator asserts that Jesus is in the bosom of the Father. Verse 18b. A phrase that will reappear in the scene of Jesus' final meal on the night of his betrayal. As the Son who possesses that unique relationship to God, Jesus is the one who reveals the Father to humanity. This is his most important role in the world. As in the 2 previous sections of the prologue, themes are introduced in verses 14 to 18 which come into play later in the story. One example is found in chapter 14, where Jesus is discussing with the disciples his imminent departure to the Father, and he insists that no one can come to the Father apart from him. Philip proclaims, "Lord, show us the Father, that will be enough for us," in verse 8. The reader already knows that Jesus is the one who reveals the Father to humanity. We can see it in verse 18. And sees This request, for what it is, a fundamental misunderstanding of Jesus' origin and identity. Jesus goes on to explain, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father in verse 9, an explicit affirmation of the statement in 1 verse 18. The reader knows this, but the Philip and the other disciples show through their behavior they do not.